I'd like to hand the program over to our moderator and good friend, Troy Dow from the Walt Disney Company. Troy?
Thank you, Mark, and welcome back, everyone. I'm excited for this next panel today. I hope that you'll enjoy it. This next panel will examine the role of intellectual property in the movie business. The movie business is a business that's always been driven by innovation. Many of you know something about this. In fact, the movie business itself grew out of the invention of the first moving picture camera, known back then at the time as the kinetograph, patented in 1897 by Thomas Edison. People often think of movies as a copyright-centric business, and there is some truth to that, but the truth is that in the early days of the film business, the business was driven by patent considerations as much as anything else. And the reality is that even though there was patent protection for movies in the early days through forms of protections against public performances and protections of movies as literary works and scripts and screenplays and whatnot, it wasn't until 1912 that the statute was actually amended to recognize formally motion picture photoplays and motion pictures other than photoplays as explicitly copyrightable subject matter. So while it's true that today the movie-making business is well-rooted in the exclusive rights provided by copyright, the fact is that the success of the movie business and the consumer's interest in ever-improving imagery and storytelling in movies, as well as innovative new ways of accessing and consuming those stories, is really driven by the confluence of many forms of intellectual property. So we have a great panel today that's going to talk about many aspects of that. Let me take a moment just to introduce our panelists. I know we have a rule here that we typically limit our introductions to name and title of our panelists, and I'll largely adhere to that, but I'm going to take moderator liberty just for a second with Garrett Brown to tell you a little about him, since we kind of have a celebrity in our midst here. So Garrett is an Oscar and Emmy award-winning cinematographer and the inventor of the Steadicam camera system. His work can be seen in more than 70 motion pictures, and his Steadicam is just one of his many inventions related to camera stabilization technology. He's a 2013 inductee into the Inventors Hall of Fame, and last year was awarded the Nikola Tesla Satellite Award for Visionary Achievement in Filmmaking Technology. We're pleased to have him here with us today. Ben Scheffner is Vice President for Legal Affairs at the Motion Picture Association of America. Justin Hughes is the William H. Hannon Professor of Law at Loyola School of Law in Los Angeles. And Eric Priest is the Assistant Professor of Law and the Faculty Director of the LLM program at the University of Oregon School of Law. We're pleased to have each of these panelists with us today. We will go in that order, and we will start by turning the time over to Garrett. Thank you.
We do not proceed without the clicker. I'm afraid I caused some havoc here, being a Mac person arriving lately among PC persons, a keynote among PowerPoints. So bear with us a little bit. In 2015, we will attempt to show a movie or two. I am not an engineer or a scientist of any sort. I was a highly motivated private citizen, and I had the astonishing good fortune to chase something that I actually found, and the something was something that turned an industry on its ear. But I was the guy that needed it first, and if this video plays, you'll understand why I needed it almost more than anybody else. Can you hear me, by the way? All right? And you'll understand why being 3,000 miles from Hollywood was a great bit of good luck for me, because nothing that I did in the early movie business was sort of cut and dried Hollywood. I learned my trade in the Free Library of Philadelphia. I read 30 feet of film books to become a filmmaker. And of course they were out of date, so I taught myself to be a 1940s filmmaker. Hence my purchase of used gigantic dollies to move the camera and so on and so on. I had right then and there an invention with a remarkable property, and that is you could show someone the effect without showing them how it was done, which was amazing. You can show a shot that is clearly impossible by 1974 standards, and give them no clue how it was done, except for Stanley Kubrick, who, when he saw the reel, said, oh, by the way, there's 14 frames of shadow on the ground to give away how it's done. And we all hastened into the projection room, and he was right. We clipped out the 14 frames. But this reel of 30 impossible shots, which I took to Hollywood, the factory threw out the negative idiotically in the 90s. And we'd been without this thing for years. And I happened to, as I was throwing away some cans, one was too heavy and there was an intact print. So happily I can show you the reel that we took to Hollywood and that was sent to all these guys that has shots that are impossible, right? So immediately it created an uproar, and I was immediately working with the prototype, and one of the first ones was Rocky, which was a great bit of good luck, shot in Philadelphia. I got to chase Stallone up the steps. And here's another little bit of footage that Avildsen, the director, just sent me. And this you should play, I think.
From the
It should
Windows
be called,
Media?
yeah, it should be called Avildsen. You'll have to take my word for it that the 30 shots are truly revolutionary and impossible. But
Sorry, which one is it?
Rocky 75, that one.
Rocky.
Yeah. This is home movies that somebody on...
My assistant cameraman was Ralph Hotchkiss. Ralph introduced me to Garrett Brown, the man who invented the Steadicam, though at the time it didn't even have a name. Without Garrett, we couldn't have gotten some of our best shots. Rocky was the second movie ever to use the Steadicam. The first one was Bound for Glory the year before. When I saw Garrett's sample reel, he had a shot of his wife, Ellen, running up the stairs of the art museum. I said, I know just where that's going to go. Before dawn the next morning, we were on the steps of the Philadelphia Art Museum. Garrett?
Yeah, get me back into the PowerPoint. Thanks, Christina. We in?
Yes, are we on the right slide?
So that's my first patent, circa 1977. A pretty fundamental one, 4 things that had to be done for this phenomenon to work in order. A gimbal. Don't check your laser, by the way I just did. A gimbal, right where my hand is, an arm suspension so that it floats at the fingertip, because if you're holding it hard, it's very unstable. Spread out masses so that the center of gravity is right at that gimbal 38, as we say in the patent world. And some way to look at the image. Initially, a fiber optic viewfinder with 398,000 fibers and an absolutely perfect image at the other end of it, except that this thing is on your head jerking around when you're running. And if your head is off level, your actor is off level. There were a few hazards with that. And we ended up with a video finder, which is what they use to this day. When that patent issued in '77, I thought to myself, oh, Lord, I'll be 53 when this baby expires. I'll be dead. That's great. 1994 arrived and the patent expired, and I was still alive. But fortunately, I've had a string of others. And this license for manufacturing this object, Steadicam, is still alive 40 years after the initial invention, which is, I think, quite astonishing. This is the first model that they made, and there have been now 7 generations of these things. And as of '94, you can imagine the enthusiasm for would-be infringers all around the world. There are now 50 copies of Steadicam, of the basic fundamental patent, and we're still dancing and still improving this thing. I know this is not a typical patent. As our wonderful speaker pointed out at lunch, it's usually incremental improvements, and I had the amazing good fortune of doing something fundamental in that instance. And the most fun of all was I got to use it on all these movies. I've had a wonderfully lucky and good fun kind of existence with this stuff. We'll go back to the PowerPoint if we can.
Sure.
And even the stuff that is intensely annoying isn't annoying enough to spoil the fun of all this. I don't want to sound smug about it, but I would recommend the idea of inventing to anybody, kids, anybody, thinking in terms of, in inventive terms about your work, your life, your marriage, anything, because when you get right down to it, it is finding a way to get something that's missing, no matter what area of your life or existence or human existence you're talking about. I'll just leave you one thing, because I find this appalling and amusing at the same time. Among our recent little inventions is little tiny Steadicams that work with GoPro cameras and phones and things like that. And the smallest one is called the Curve. It's an absolutely lovely little gadget, and the debut of the Curve in Asia took place at a trade show in Singapore. And I immediately was told by my scouts that I should go up to the 8th floor to a booth from a rather odd-looking company, and there was an exact copy of our device, except they painted over the logo. And this, we were led to believe, might have been a so-called backdoor product in which it marches out the back door of the factory you hired to make it offshore, But these images came from Amazon today. And so there is, I have to apologize to the Yasu people, I'm not sure of the present pronunciation, or to the Aratot people, or to the, doesn't even have a name people. But all 3 of them are our beloved little Steadicam Curve. So clearly something is up. And when we tell Amazon about it, they're very good about it. They take down these things. But I think it's a little bit like trying to get rid of roaches. I have an infringer sprayer come in, and he sprays for infringement. But they do proliferate. So yes, ask me about China when we get down to that. Okay. Thank you very much.
Ben?
No video?
No video.
Perfect. Oh, sorry about that. And then this. Stop.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here at George Mason. So it's funny, at lunch, I was talking with my fellow table mates about this phenomenon that we often hear about working in this world, which is that people love movies, but they kind of hate the movie industry. And we're talking about theories about why that's so. I have my own sort of about how movies are fun, but the industry is made up of people like lawyers and accountants and all sorts of non-fun people. And the contrast between those is just sort of shocking to people, and it causes them not to like the industry. But during Garrett's presentation, all I could think about was, if people realized that the industry was actually made up of people like Garrett inventing cool, interesting new things, we'd probably be a lot more popular. But back to the unpopular. You're going to hear from several lawyers right now, and going to be talking all in different ways about sort of what intellectual property law, and for my presentation in particular, copyright law, sort of how it undergirds and creates the success of the motion picture industry. So I know being here at George Mason and specifically at CPIP, I know a lot of you have law and economics sort of orientation, and that's sort of the tack that I'm going to take. This might be a little bit basic for many of you, but I think it sort of demonstrates the sort of application of those basic principles by which you all live and love apply, not just to the economy in general, but to the motion picture industry in particular. So why do we have copyright? Well, taking a step back, I think any successful market economy needs, at the very least, three things. We need to recognize the concept of private property. We need to recognize the principle of freedom of contract, that once you have this property, you're allowed to sort of make voluntary arrangements between people to benefit everyone. And then you need some way to enforce those contracts or those rules if there are those people who don't want to follow them. And my point overall, again, is that the motion picture business, the market for motion pictures that results in all this creation is really no different than any other market. And let's see sort of how those three basic principles apply to the motion picture industry. So starting with property rights. This is kind of an obvious point, but the Copyright Act defines what the property rights are in a motion picture. Copyright law does essentially two basic things when you get down to it. It defines the scope of what's copyrightable, and as Troy mentioned, motion pictures have been very clearly covered by the law since the early part of the 20th century. And then under the current copyright law, it's Section 106, which is really sort of the heart of the act, and it basically says, okay, you have these rights, this subject matter is copyrightable, here are the rights that are actually attendant to them. And in the motion picture industry, the most important ones, same as most other sort of entertainment industries, you have the exclusive right to make copies, you have the exclusive right to publicly perform your works, and you have the exclusive right to prepare derivative works. So if I make Fast and Furious 1, I also have the exclusive right to make Fast and Furious 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. No one else can do this. All right, so how about the second major concept, freedom of contract? The basic point is sort of the dog that didn't bark here, is that the Copyright Office actually says very little about how you are able to contract with the rights that are granted or recognized by the Act. Under the 1976 Act, you're allowed to sort of slice and dice your rights into as many ways as possible. The concept is called divisibility. So if I'm the copyright owner in a motion picture, I can license the public performance rights for theaters to one company, and I can license the public performance rights to broadcast television to an entirely different company. To a third company, I can grant the rights to make DVDs, and then, of course, fourth company to put them on the internet and this particular platform or that particular platform. And so the Copyright Act doesn't really say anything at all about that, which is a good thing. Sort of lets private entities enter into whatever contracts they think are most advantageous. Now, that's not entirely true. There's some exceptions to that. There's a few compulsory licenses in the Copyright Act. This is essentially, whether you like it or not, you've got to license your copyrighted works in a relatively narrow set of circumstances where Congress has determined in its wisdom that there is a market failure and that the government essentially has to come in and set the rules for when you can or can't or must license the works. And the most prominent examples are with cable television. Essentially, there's a compulsory license which says that if you have a broadcast network, the copyrighted works that are carried on that broadcast network must be licensed to a cable operator. There's a similar operation for satellite providers like DirecTV. And then, of course, the music licensing world is kind of dominated in many ways by compulsory licenses, just essentially because the transactions cost otherwise would be too high. A couple other examples to keep in mind, the sort of exceptions to the principle of freedom of contract in the motion picture industry. There's something called the Termination of Transfers provision in the 1976 Copyright Act. It's a purely paternalistic provision, which says essentially this, is that when you're an author and you write a book or a movie or a piece of a song, you don't have very much power there at the beginning. So some big rapacious movie company or record label or music publisher is going to come and make a deal that's very disadvantageous to you. They're going to make a fortune. You're going to get very little. So what the Copyright Act says is 35 years later, no matter what is in your contract from the beginning, 35 years later, the original author can come back and reclaim that right. And then, of course, there's FCC regulations, which technically, of course, aren't copyright regulations, copyright law, but the FCC has all sorts of regulations about essentially broadcast television, things like must carry and retransmission consent and all sorts of complicated things which I know only a little bit about, just enough to be dangerous. So what does this freedom of contract give us? The answer is a myriad of different business models and tons of options for consumers. The major motion picture studios that we represent, they license, of course, the traditional theaters, but that's actually a relatively small portion of their business in the US today. Only about 25% of revenue to motion picture studios in the US today is from licensing it to movie theaters. Of course, they also license broadcast TV networks, premium and cable, basic and premium cable networks, for replication on DVD and Blu-ray discs. Of course, and there's different models in there, whether you buy or rent. And then there's pay-per-view, video on demand, subscription video on demand, and then, of course, all sorts of brand new internet download and rental options. This slide just gives you a little bit of a sense of how the relative size of those different markets that I've talked about. So red is the US, blue is the world. And you'll see that in the US, again, theatrical distribution revenue is only about 25% of total revenue. Home video and that, again, pay-per-view, cable, et cetera, is, I'm sorry, that's really DVD and Blu-ray is about 40%. Basic cable looks like around 12%, and so on down. It's interesting to note the contrast when you look worldwide, where theatrical is even lower. It's only about 15% of total revenue, but the biggest market is actually broadcast. So in other words, when Disney or Warner Brothers produces a movie, they will enter into a license agreement with the major broadcaster in whether it's Germany or India or Japan to license the movies to be shown on television. It used to be a much bigger phenomenon here. You remember, Saturday nights, I believe, when the networks would actually show a regular old movie. Not so much anymore because there's so many other options, but still a big deal overseas. And so what does all that freedom of contract within the basic rules of copyright give us? Well, as of 2014, there are 110 services in the US on which you can watch legally online TV and film content. And 110 is a lot, but the even more remarkable thing about that number is that when you go back fewer than 20 years ago, the number was essentially zero. Again, the copyright law didn't say a whole lot, or almost nothing, about, you must license to this kind of entity and that kind of entity and the other kind of entity. This was all sort of voluntary private ordering within those basic rules that the copyright owner has the exclusive right to make copies and to publicly perform and to distribute and make derivative works of its works. And then the third sort of basic principle that I laid out at the beginning is the rule of law. Of course, rights aren't worth anything if you can't actually enforce them. And this is sort of a tale of two cities here. On paper, the Copyright Act is great in terms of the rule of law. It has all these remedies that go along with the rights. Of course, the most basic one that everyone knows about are civil lawsuits. It has all these great remedies in there. You can get actual damages, you can get the infringer's profits, statutory damages and injunctions. And then we have criminal enforcement for the most egregious infringers, those who meet a certain threshold in terms of monetary value and in terms of the volume of infringement. But the other side of the coin is what actually happens in practice. And again, it varies depending on sort of the context. In the theatrical market, the story is actually pretty good. There are essentially no pirate movie theaters in the United States. If you tried to set one up, you'd get shut down within probably a few hours. So essentially, nobody tries to do that. It's a very well-functioning market. Hard goods, DVDs and Blu-rays, there is piracy. You go into certain cities, and there's essentially black markets on the streets for them. And it's funny, I was actually taking an Uber the other day, and the guy was selling pirated DVDs out of the back of the Uber. So enforcement, not perfect, but just like in every industry, there's a bit of leakage. There's a bit of shoplifting. If you're in the retail industry, it's essentially a problem, but we can live with it. And then, of course, the real problems, though, in enforcement are online, and probably where the law and enforcement methods haven't really kept up with technology. So what do we in the motion picture industry do to enforce those rights, especially online? A couple of things that enforcement is not. Enforcement is not trying to get the piracy level down to zero. Everybody knows that that's an unattainable goal, and it's also not the goal to sort of do enforcement for enforcement's sake. There's lots of things that we see, the guy selling the DVDs out of the Uber, or other sort of relatively minor infringements that, although we don't like and it gets us riled up and angry, we don't waste a whole lot of time enforcing on. What we look for is those forms of piracy that are really in competition with the legitimate market. Competition with legal services is great. If somebody has alternatives to going and watching movies and they want to promote them and that takes away some of our business, that's life, that's capitalism. But we don't like is when illegal services that don't have to make the investments of, I think it's the average major motion picture studio movie costs about $137 million to make. They don't have to make those investments. They nonetheless want a free ride off them. Those are the kinds of services and devices that we will actually enforce against. So how do we do that? We directly target the bad actors with either civil lawsuits or, in the most egregious cases, criminal referrals. And then there's all sorts of intermediaries on the internet, whether they are ISPs or web video sites or payment processors or advertisers. And our focus these days is not so much on direct enforcement against many of those, but on what we call voluntary initiatives, which is essentially saying to these various entities, hey, piracy is a problem. It's a piracy for our industry, but it's also a problem for your own brand. It might be because of reputational harms to be associated with pirate websites. It might be because they are engaged in fraud, or they carry with them malware, or it diminishes the reputational value of your brand. So we should work together to stop that. A couple just prominent examples really quickly as I wrap up. You may have heard of something called the Copyright Alert System. That's our voluntary initiative. It's been in place for several years now. The major motion picture and motion picture studios and record labels have deals with the 5 major ISPs here in the U.S. Essentially to send notices to those who use their ISP to infringe via peer-to-peer. They get notices by email usually telling them, hey, we've detected you sharing works via your account, please knock it off. If they don't knock it off, they get another notice, a little bit harsher message. A little bit harsher message might make them watch a little video telling them to knock it off, and sort of graduates up. We've also been spending a lot of time working with payment processors, the credit card companies, along with entities like PayPal and other similar online processing services to get them to realize that it's not in their interest to be working with pirate sites. And then advertisers. Advertisers is an umbrella term for many, many, many different variants of sort of players in the online advertising space, whether it's the brand themselves, the advertising agencies, the media buyers, the advertising networks, these so-called online auction houses, which engage in this very, very sophisticated and quick and quite innovative way to sell and place advertising all over the internet. But the problem is a lot of pirate sites, of course, are funded by advertising. They want people to come and freely view movies or listen to songs, and they accept advertising. So we've been doing a lot of work working with those various players that I just mentioned in the advertising ecosystem, so that they will, again, realize that working with pirate sites is not in any of our long-term interest. And just to give a plug, there was one of the major, it may actually be the biggest sort of online media buyer in the U.S. A company called Group M, just announced a sort of major step where they were going to only place ads on websites that are actually certified as sort of, they've taken steps to make sure that they are piracy-free. So that's sort of a basic landscape of how the copyright law and this relatively simple rules that it's set up has sort of led to the proliferation of the kind of content and innovation that we've seen in the marketplace today. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ben. Justin?
Thanks, Troy. I want to thank Adam and Mark for including me, but I particularly want to thank a person who may not get enough attention for her work on this, Christina Pietro, who's walking right in the middle. For those of us who go to a lot of conferences, Christina is the type of organizer who sends just the right amount of information, but not too much. And that's magical, and I thank her for her work. For people who've been in this arena for a while, you know the debates are extreme, and Mark did an excellent presentation about one of those debates where it's extreme, with people saying extreme things that are unproven. And in the terms of this conference, there are lots of people out there these days who think that intellectual property is not needed as a platform for creativity or innovation, or even those who think that intellectual property has evolved into a bad platform for innovation and creativity. And there are those, of course, many of us in the room, who think that intellectual property is a necessary platform for creativity. Now, literally speaking, we know it's not a necessary platform, right? We know that there was culture in progress without intellectual property, and we know that within particular ecosystems, intellectual property, or in particular copyright, is not that important. So if you take poetry, it is extremely hard, even if we had 100% enforcement, to support yourself as a poet. And most of the great poets of the 20th century in the United States had other professions. William Carlos Williams was a pediatrician, Wallace Stevens was an insurance executive, Archibald MacLeish was a librarian, Sylvia Plath was a receptionist and a teacher. So we know that in some areas, copyright is not so important for the continued production of culture. Those of us who are law professors will continue to spew out our law review articles regardless of copyright or not. And law school students will continue to write notes, and that all will go along. But here we are talking about the film industry, and I think I was asked to be on this panel because I go to a lot of movies. In cinemas, I've seen over 85 movies this year in cinema already. I like hanging out in large, dark rooms with strangers. And one of the characteristics about the debate about films, of course, is how much do we need copyright protection? And most of us believe we need a great deal of copyright protection in the audiovisual industry. But one of the great things about audiovisual industry is when we're having these debates about intellectual property, we're usually discussing expressly or in the background some untestable, unknowable world, which the advocate thinks would be better. You know, kind of like the BBC series about if the Nazis won the war. And we're imagining that world, and it's very hard to argue about that world, how software would have developed if it had only had patent protection, not copyright protection, or how software would have developed or not developed if there hadn't been any intellectual property protection. And the nice thing about the audiovisual world is we actually have a reasonable real-world experiment in the film industry of a major film industry without copyright. And that is the film industry in Anglophone West Africa. Now, just this summer, Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari said that the Nigerian film industry was being ruined by piracy, and he promised to crack down. But in truth, if we're looking at it objectively, it's a film industry that produces over 1,000 films a year and is 4th or 5th in global revenue, depending on who's measuring, and yet has no effective copyright protection. So this is the kind of stuff that makes Mike Masnick at Tech Dirt go wild, right? No, see, you don't need it. You don't need, how does this happen though? Well, Nigerian Films, how many people have ever seen a Nigerian film? Okay, all right, not many. Did you enjoy it? Some of them. A lot of spirituality, a lot of magic. But anyway, these films are typically shot on location. They're shot without what we would call sets. They are typically shot in 2 to 3 weeks. And the average budget, depending upon whether you read if you believe Wikipedia, it's $25,000, but I believe The Economist that says it's $100,000. Sometimes the budgets get bigger. In 2009, the Nigerian film industry crossed a major artistic threshold with a film called The Figurine, which cost $330,000. Now, I say that because that's the catering budget for a few days on Iron Man. And you need to understand that without copyright, there is an expressive industry, but it's an expressive industry that only permits investment up to a very small figure, a figure that is on the $100,000 average below the annual income of many people, if not most people in this room. That's all you can invest in a film. Why is there any investment in all? Because, as a good economist would know, it's a direct-to-video market, and it's 1 to 2 weeks before the pirates take over. So in Nigeria, a film producer has 1 to 2 weeks of what they call euphemistically the mating season, in which they have a first mover advantage and they can recoup as much of their investment and make as much profit as they can. Or as the New York Times calls it, it is entertainment in a Hobbesian state. Now, could we do that in the United States with film? Well, I was thinking about it because I've always been struck that if in cinemas, and it was interesting because Ben said we have excellent enforcement in theatrical markets. That's true, Ben, but it's not copyright enforcement at all. It's real property enforcement. It's real property laws used to enforce protection of the intellectual property. You are granted access to the film on someone else's real property, and you agree to the terms and conditions of your presence on their property. And so we could imagine a cinema world where we had cinemas and no copyright. We had no broadcast release, no DVD release, and you had to go through magnetometers and TSA pat-downs when you went to the cinema. And you could have such a film industry, but I don't think many of us would like it very much. Beyond the control of real property, there would effectively be no lead time at our technological place, and the easiest way to understand that is to think of the Aereo case. So one place you might argue, well, if you had no copyright, you could continue to get audiovisual production, is with television, on the argument that if you keep it in the can and you have sufficient security control at home, when you broadcast that episode the first time, you can at least make back the money on the advertising. Except an Aereo-like technology defeats even that, because it records it and sends it back out on a 2-second delay and can send it back out without the advertising, meaning your advertisers have no reason to know that you will be the platform for the delivery versus Aereo. So we're in a technological state where if we had a Hobbesian world without copyright, we genuinely would be unable to support investment beyond some ceiling like the Nigerian film industry, a very, very low ceiling. Now, Ben talked about he made the basic case for you, and he did a fine job on the classic traditional copyright rights, reproduction, distribution, public performance. But to me, I was interested in this panel because I was interested in Section 1201. Now, how many of you think you are familiar enough with 1201 to dream about it? Okay, well, very few of us, but I am, unfortunately, all right? So Troy is also probably. Section 1201 was put into the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, in 1998. And I would say that at least initially, Troy might differ, but I'd bet in the first 10 years it was probably the most debated part of the law, the most contested part of the law, because it is a provision on the protection of digital rights management or technological protection measures. And Section 1201 uses extremely complex language, But it basically says that where a copyright owner has used an access control, that is a digital rights management technological tool, to control access, you are not permitted to break that digital lock. So we have a world of digital locks that control access, and then we have a separate set of rules about digital locks that control 106 rights, the right of reproduction, the right of performance, the right of distribution. So basically, Section 1201 says no distribution of digital lockpicks. That is, no one can develop devices to defeat digital rights management technology when it's protecting copyrighted works, no distribution of such devices, and no picking of digital locks when they protect access. Now, that seems like an old topic to some people in copyright. Like, we had all those arguments, and the world has moved in a direction beyond digital rights management. And if you think about the world of CDs, if you think about the world of music, that is certainly true. Because digital rights management, as most people conceive of it and talk about it, and if you go to Wikipedia, 80% of the entry on digital rights management in Wikipedia is what you would call on-disk digital rights management, or on the copy. And the paradigmatic examples of that are limitations on reproduction or access that you see on CDs and DVDs, and you saw on some online music files. And how many people in this room remember the Sony rootkit debacle? Yes, the rootkit debacle of putting a very unfriendly form of digital rights management on the copy. And of course, digital rights management still exists today in the video game world. Another kind of final nail in the coffin of digital rights management arguably happened this past summer when Microsoft announced that Windows 10 was disabling and no longer recognizing the safe disk and secure on DRM technology that had been used in the early aughts because of a security hole that had been discovered in 2007 and later, and they just decided it's too insecure for the new Windows system. I'll read one blogger so you get the flavor of this. I won't blame Windows 10 for this, but it's another example of the harm done by restrictive or draconian DRM. So is Section 1201 just another backwater of the Copyright Act? You might think so from some of the stuff you read. But I want to convince you that, in fact, the whole distribution system we are now enjoying, and the one that Ben described as present and emerging, is one that depends on Section 1201. Why is that so? Because we are increasingly shifting from a system of distributing copies to one where we are making available works. We are making available works through Hulu and YouTube and Netflix and Pandora and SiriusXM in the same way that those of us in the room who are lawyers were having works made available to us on Westlaw and Nexus for years and years and years. And in this shift to making available, all of you who are lawyers know that there's a big difference between delivery as a stream and delivery as a download. But what is that difference? The only difference, because the same bits effectively come to your computer, is digital rights management in the platform that is managing the delivery. The only thing that separates a download from a stream is DRM, is the software of the delivery. And for that reason, 1201 has become this kind of background law that is actually very dominant in the business models we're using. And I have to read you this quotation from 2006. Many of you know that a NGO, a nonprofit named Public Knowledge, is very concerned about privacy and copyright and access to information issues, and was run for many years. Its founder was a woman named Gigi Sohn. I think Gigi's at the FTC? FCC, sorry. And in 2006, Gigi wrote this great paper when she was talking about DRM, a little carefully, and she said she'd just come back from the Consumer Electronics Show. Now, this is 9 years ago, mind you, but also 8 years after the DMCA. And she said that DRM, quote, tools protect some of the content and consumers can decide whether the protection is flexible enough for their needs, end quote. Quote, the market for delivering content digitally over new technologies is working, end quote. I think you'd agree with that. And then she said, quote, all of these great developments happened without government intervention, end quote. And that's when I wanted to strangle her. Because 1201 is that kind of intervention. It is this background rule which actually is dividing a market and making possible the kind of market creation and market discrimination that is necessary for the full exploitation of the investment we are seeing in the audiovisual world. So while I agree with Ben on the importance of the fundamental copyright rights, I'm just kind of thinking these days, really, we really don't appreciate what we did not even 20 years ago in saying to the world, thou shalt not pick digital locks. Because by doing that, we essentially tamped down what otherwise would have been a technological war between people building defenses and people building digital lockpicks. And we have permitted, in essence, perhaps not completely intentionally, a flourishing of markets that people in Congress and people in the Clinton administration could not have imagined 20 years ago. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Eric.
All right, thanks. Hello? It's working now? Okay. So, thank you, Troy. Also, like Professor Hughes, I'd like to thank CPIP and Adam, Mark, Matt, Christina, everyone else here who has made this a really fantastic event and who's also provided a great platform for this kind of discussion. Like Justin, I'm probably on this panel because I've watched a lot of movies, although I've watched a lot of Chinese movies, not Nigerian films. So part of my interest in my intellectual property research is in the creative ecosystem in China. And so why would a discussion about China be of particular relevance on a panel in the US on intellectual property? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, as many people in here who are familiar with the US music industry, movie industry are no doubt aware, China has become an 800-pound gorilla market in the movie industry space. China is now the second largest box office in the world and is set to overtake the US as the largest box office in about 3 years. And in fact, recently, I believe, just had the first month where the Chinese box office returns actually exceeded US box office returns. So we're already really seeing this starting to happen. This is, for someone who hasn't closely followed these developments in China, but might have looked at it, say, 10 years ago, would be shocking because 10 years ago, when I started working with copyright industries in China, the total box office take in China was about $300 million US. Now it's about 5 billion. And a major part of this increase in this meteoric rise in box office revenue, in fact, the entire explanation is an increase in movie theaters and a corresponding or a simultaneous increase in disposable income of consumers and an interest in going to movie theaters. So China now has nearly as many movie theaters in the US, and of course there's much more room for expansion given China's population. And so you have this incredible increase in revenue being generated in China from feature films. But it's almost entirely, it's about 90% of it is coming from box office revenue, which is interesting because, as Justin just pointed out, box office revenue is all based on an exclusive rights model. It's based on, of course, copyright is in the background, but the primary right that's being enforced that makes box office revenue work, that makes the theatrical model work, is good old traditional real property rights, right? The right to exclude someone who doesn't pay from entering a controlled space to view the film. So that's a very interesting development, but it's not the only development that I want to focus on. What I want to talk about is how, in fact, exclusive rights and exclusive copyrights are becoming the kind of new media model in China. So not just this kind of physical exclusion in the box office context, but also copyright, exclusionary rights in the online distribution model for film. It's an interesting development as far as I'm concerned, because as someone who's been looking at this for the last 10 years, China is often trotted out, and certainly was a number of years ago, including by me, as a kind of a window into future business models, monetization models for digital content online. Why? Because China doesn't have the quote-unquote legacy copyright industries that we have in the West. China hasn't ever had industries, film industries, music industries that were based on licensing, that were based on aftermarket sales. As Ben pointed out, in the U.S., theatrical revenue is a minority revenue stream. In China, it's always been the revenue stream, right? There have been no aftermarket sales, there's been no DVDs, legitimate DVD market, legitimate VCD market, et cetera. So it's interesting to look at China and say, well, gee, you know, if, in sort of the same way that Justin talked about Nigeria, if we have a market where you've essentially had a dysfunctional IP system, and if intellectual property is supposed to drive innovation, then shouldn't we see essentially no innovation in China in the entertainment space? Shouldn't we see no one investing in the production of films, no one investing in the production of new music, et cetera? And if we see investment in the production of films, investment in the production of new music, then is that a sign that maybe intellectual property, again, the same arguments made about Nigeria, that intellectual property, that copyright, isn't really doing the work that people in the copyright industries argue that it is, and perhaps it's not all that necessary. And so there was a look at, well, gee, in this market that's already been dealing with endemic piracy, which is now post-Napster kind of a new thing for developed copyright markets, well, maybe that's where the new business models are going to come from. So for example, about 9 years ago, I was a fellow at the Berkman Center at Harvard, and I gave a presentation called Asia at the Cutting Edge, talking about these kind of new monetization models that were coming out in a market that couldn't rely on copyright and intellectual property rights as a monetization, sort of a primary monetization model. So what about these cutting edge models? What about this cutting edge monetization? Well, what's interesting, what you've seen happen in China, and again, this is the movie industry panel, so I'll focus on online video. And in some ways, I already previewed these comments yesterday when Sean so graciously invited me to join his panel yesterday and talk about this. So what happened in the online video distribution space is very interesting. In the mid-aughts, you saw a proliferation of YouTube clone type sites in China that were notorious havens for piracy. They allowed users to upload whatever content they wanted, foreign content, domestic content, all the latest films, were available, both Hollywood films and domestic films, regional films, Korean, Taiwanese, Japanese. You could get every episode of Friends, and it was an incredibly popular thing to watch in around 2006, 2007. I was actually working in the internet space in China at the time, and websites like Youku and Tudou, which were the major sort of YouTube clones there, were the bane of my existence because I was working in the copyright licensing space, and nobody was licensing copyrighted content because there was no point, because all of it was available for free. The head of one major Chinese online service provider went on a TV talk show and said, anyone who's actually in the copyright licensing business is an idiot. Unfortunately, my Chinese mother-in-law watched that and got all nervous about her son-in-law's career. And something very interesting happened around 2009. The copyright owners who had gotten tired of litigating against these websites, and this, in fact, is a result, the reason that their litigations became so frustrating, there are many reasons behind it, but one of them was the fact that damages are so low. So even if you're successful in a copyright infringement lawsuit in China, the average damages at that time, and it hasn't changed much, between about 2006 and 2009 was $5,000. So that's what you could win as a plaintiff. Now, even in cases that involved more valuable copyrights, there was a study done that found that the average damage award was about $18,000 US, and was less than 10% on average of the damages claimed, excuse me, in these cases. So what happened was the copyright owners, both domestic and in many ways largely domestic, and some foreign copyright owners, formed a coalition and went after advertisers. They went after, in particular, Coke and Pepsi, but other major transnational advertisers as well, who are big big intellectual property owners in their own right, pressured them and said, look, this is wrong. You're basically bankrolling these websites. That was the lifeline for these websites, and they decided we're going to apply pressure where it really matters to the websites. The lawsuits are the cost of doing business for the websites, but they don't want to lose these major advertisers. And the major advertisers, by and large, said, yeah, we agree. We don't want to support this. And so, for example, Coke was pulling its ads from Youku and Tudou. It made a lot of news in China. And the websites turned on a dime. And they basically purged the pirated content from their websites, turned around, and then started licensing contents. And as long as they were licensing contents, they decided, well, it makes sense to use, if we're going to invest in content, we might as well make it a competitive advantage. And so they wanted exclusive licenses. They wanted to be able to be the only website that could show Friends or show the latest popular Chinese serial dramas. And so this created this incredible licensing bubble to the point where, as I mentioned yesterday, you had an increase in content fees that went from, during the heyday of piracy, you could basically buy a license for the most popular show in China for $1,500. 2 years later, it cost $300,000 to get an exclusive license for one episode of the most popular show in China. And this was so the result of this sudden and extremely aggressive shift toward exclusive licensing was sort of threefold. First of all, it was a big financial boon for copyright owners. Second of all, it created this new monetizable distribution channel, because now these websites realized they had to pay for content. So it created this new monetizable distribution channel for indie filmmakers who were making this whole new genre of films called micro movies that were made, that were short films that could be watched, say, on one train commute, on a mobile device, et cetera. And this had this incredible sort of effect of an explosion of creation. creative activity. And it also gave these websites an opportunity to differentiate their services. One problem with this model, however, has been that it is, because of the exclusive licensing and the licensing bubble that drove prices up, is that it's, in the long run, unclear whether it's sustainable. Why? Because these websites are paying out as much as half or more of their revenue is going back out in content licensing fees. And in China, ad revenue is still notoriously low. And so the revenue isn't covering the content licenses. And so these websites are scrambling to figure out how to make this business work. And what have they turned to? So, we've talked about these, what's the next sort of digital utopia monetization model? They've gone even deeper into exclusive licensing. So what they're doing now, they're licensing more exclusive content, trying to get the prices down, and also going into original content production. And so what's happened is you've turned these intermediaries into stakeholders in the copyright ecosystem. And so now they're out there enforcing their copyrights, enforcing their exclusive licenses, because they're standing in the shoes of the copyright owners. So although this is a $4 billion industry, it's actually, in fact, an industry that's not yet profitable, that's seeking these new monetization models. But at the end of the day, if you talk to people in the online industry in China, what they say is what we really need, what really has to happen is a pay-per-view model. We need consumers to pay, a subscription model, a Netflix-type model. People have to put money into the system in order to make it work, and the only model that's really going to work, the only model that's sustainable for us, is an exclusive rights-based model where we own licenses to the content, we can limit access, it's not freely available, and it's not ad-supported, because while the industry's pulling in $4 billion a year, it's not enough to cover the content costs. So websites like Youku, for example, one of the largest websites, plans to invest $1.6 billion over the next 3 years in producing its own content production. Now, this goes beyond the movie industry. So I guess my wrap-up comment is to say that this is changing the norms in the online sort of copyright protection environment in China. And now you see music companies are going out and doing exclusive licenses with former sort of notorious havens for unlicensed content. And even in the book industry, so the new trend for online e-publishing is to give away serials, right? Give away these sort of one chapter a week serials. And the question is, well, how do you monetize that? You're giving away this free content. Well, at the end of the day, again, they've turned to an exclusive licensing model. So the websites allow anyone to post content on the websites, but they have to grant an exclusive website license to the website, and the content that's most popular at the website then turns around, grants exclusive or sells exclusive licenses to media producers, film producers, television producers, and they monetize it that way. So at the end of the day, it all goes back to this rights of exclusion based on even real property rights, right? You sell tickets to this content. In a funny way, it's sort of returned to the 20th century. I mean, the market people have looked at for examples of the future of online content, the future of new media, have all sort of realized there's no way to monetize without exclusive rights. So it's kind of, meet the new media, it's the same as the old media.
Thank you.
So I want to take some time and give the audience a chance to ask some questions, but while you're thinking for just a minute or so of some of the questions you want to ask the panelists, I do have a question or two that I wanted to ask and follow up. Eric, you give a really interesting sort of explanation of how the market, the entertainment industries and the markets in China have reacted to the phenomenon of piracy there. Garrett, you talked a little bit in your presentation about some of that and its impact on you here. I just wanted to ask, what's your experience in dealing with some of what you've seen coming out of China, and how does that impact you and your business and what you do as an inventor? You describe a process where you invented sort of out of necessity, and you had a need to develop something that wasn't there, but how does what you find now in your experience with China impact what you do as an inventor?
Well, I confess I find it a bit frightening because it's so vast and the resources are so diffuse and their outlets are so diffuse. And although we have some Chinese patents, no one is very terribly encouraging about enforcement or the prospects of suing anybody there. And partly it's because it's so agile. We take advantage of that, of course, when we have something made there. This is a devil's bargain, though, because we're teaching them a lot about what we do. The early Chinese copies, even of my stuff that was patent expired, were terrible and didn't work. And we thought that was terribly encouraging. We thought, well, there you go. But it doesn't make any sense. If you're going to copy something, such as a spring, it's not rocket science. Measure the coils and count the coils and the diameter of the coils and what's the material. That's the spring. So it was almost perverse that it didn't work. Well, I'm here to tell you the most recent stuff works pretty well. And I think that either we continue to furiously invent and try to make deals, and this would be my thrust, is to try and make deals with Chinese companies to license our trademark, which is very valuable, and allow them to sell in China and allow us to sell here what they make. And we're now experimenting with the first such try. And we find that this is a company that can lay on 200 engineers in an afternoon and do stuff that, you know, horrifyingly, we do not do in the US. So I'm guardedly, what's the middle ground of optimistic?
Cautiously optimistic.
I'm guardedly cautious. How's that?
Excellent, thank you. Ben, can I just ask you for a second? You gave a terrific presentation about the role of sort of copyright in the film industry. As Garrett just made a reference to trademark and how that kind of plays into his strategy of how to deal with exploiting the value of what he's developed. Could you take just a minute and maybe give us your perspective on how some of these other forms of intellectual property, trademark, patent, maybe even trade secret, play into the business of the movie business?
Sure. Well, I mean, as Troy mentioned in his introduction, I mean, from the very, very beginning of the motion picture industry, you've had sort of what we think of as the creative part, you know, making the actual movies, you know, the screenwriting and the cinematography, all those sort of creative aspects, sort of coexisting and interplaying with the creation of the technology to sort of present that creativity to the audience. I mean, Troy mentioned the very beginning, Thomas Edison essentially inventing the motion picture camera. And we've seen in the, you know, over a century since his first motion picture camera in 1897, just a steady progression and, you know, leaps and bounds. We have, you know, there are the sort of small innovations, incremental innovations that David Kapos talked about at lunch. Every so often we get a big leap, like the creation of the Steadicam, but there's myriad examples of sort of technological innovations, you know, protected by patent throughout the history of the industry, whether it's, you know, new technologies, whether it be in lenses and cameras, you know, more recently in exhibition, new, you know, sort of, you know, 3D exhibition and IMAX. Now we have, was it a 4K distribution into homes, all sorts of, you know, sound and video compression technologies that are you know, that are attendant to DVDs and Blu-ray discs and players. I mean, every single one of those is protected by patent. They're also, again, it's this interplay between the technology to create movies, helps you do things creatively, and is sort of more of an incentive to creativity, and it works in the other direction as well. When you have these creative ideas, you think, hey, I'd really like to be able to do X, Y, and Z through the technology. So I think it's really sort of a symbiotic relationship between sort of the copyright side and the patent side.
And stand by for virtual reality. That's going to be an astonishing sea change in the way we absorb stuff. And the big players are making huge bets on it.
Yeah,
Can
I
you
mean,
imagine the copyrights for
well,
that experience?
it's interesting that the kind of technology for sort of virtual reality and sort of holograms. One interesting issue that the industry is just starting to grapple with is the interplay between that kind of technology and right of publicity. So right of publicity, of course, protects your name and likeness. Well, people are positing, you know what if I could make, say, the next Indiana Jones movie, but I really don't want to have to pay Harrison Ford $20 million or whatever he makes. Wouldn't it be great if I could just sort of make a hologram? The technology today is probably not good enough to really substitute a hologram for the real thing. But you know what? In 5 or 10 or 20 years, it might be just good enough. And the law is going to have to grapple with that over the next couple of decades.
Great. Thank you. I do want to have time to let the audience ask some questions, so maybe we'll see those of you who have questions. If you wouldn't mind identifying yourself and sharing your question, we'll ask the panelists who answer the questions to repeat the questions just to make sure that everyone hears them. Oh. Great. Jen. Okay, how about while the mic is coming, we've got a, okay, there we go.
So I hope this is going to be a softball. I'm struck by the difference between the Nigerian and the Chinese film examples, because as Professor Hughes taught us, copyright isn't necessary to creation, but if you don't have it, you end up with Nigeria, which has tiny investment in films and rampant piracy. So how do we explain China, which seems to have a flourishing film industry, yet they also have crap copyright enforcement? So what's going on here?
Eric will have a longer answer, but I actually was careful to say Anglophone West Africa, because Francophone West Africa has a tradition of film subsidies. And certainly in the Mao period and onward, there was a state film industry. Anglophone West Africa didn't have a state film industry like Francophone West Africa has. So you'll have Nollywood directors, and Mark may know a lot about this too, that recoil at be calling African directors because they think that means like a Senegalese artiste, and they make different stuff. So I think part of its path dependency on an industry was developed as a state industry in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So up and through the 1990s, it was a state subsidized industry, and they started to privatize the industry at that point. But what ended up happening was, so first of all, you had, through the 80s and the 90s, you had some. I mean, you had certainly not close to the number of theaters today, but there were some theaters, and there was some theatrical distribution, and there was some theatrical revenue. But what you also saw was a large number of emerging Chinese filmmakers who were making films not for the Chinese market, partly because there weren't sufficient monetizable distribution channels for the films, because if you weren't one of the few films that got theatrical distribution, you weren't going to make any money from the film, because there was no monetizable aftermarket distribution or alternative market distribution. And so you would make films that would appeal to foreign critics, foreign film festivals, and the Chinese diaspora, and sell the films overseas. And there was actually for films that were successful, especially if you could get it into a film festival and it got some notoriety in the film festival, there were actually some directors who made a lot of money, got a lot of investment from foreign investors, Taiwanese and, American Western investors, Hong Kong investors into those films. The problem with that model was that those directors then were not making films for Chinese audiences. They were making films for, foreign audiences. And often they were making films that, so foreign viewers were watching these and foreign critics were saying, oh, this, oh, wow, this is an underground film from China. It was banned in China. This is really telling the story of the Chinese people, sort of in this, they're really, as Mark Beeson said yesterday, speaking the truth. Well, the reality is that many of those films have been criticized as films that weren't really speaking the truth. They were speaking the truth in a way that, or they were speaking to a foreign audience and showing a China that the foreign audience wanted to see. And so that's part of the result of not having a functioning aftermarket for films or sufficient theatrical distribution, and of course censorship.
Thank you. We got a question here.
Yeah, a very quick question for Garrett Brown.
Here's your mic.
A very quick question for Garrett Brown. So one of the constant sort of leitmotifs of critics of the patent system is that invention would take place anyway, that people are just naturally creative, and that therefore patents basically are a form of monopoly that impedes innovation. There are a number of law school professors, in fact, have written arguments like this. I'm curious, this is from your point of view as an inventor, would you have developed the Steadicam had you thought that you would not be able to earn income from it? And when you started developing the Steadicam, how much did you know about patents?
I'll try to be brief on this. My first invention was a way of silencing motion picture cameras by putting them in a vacuum housing. And I bumped into Lee DeForest, who patented the idea of a camera silent in a bell jar in 1929. And I stopped because it was clear to me that, even if I did invent it, I wouldn't earn enough money from it to, earn a living. And part of my incentive to do the Steadicam was to, improve my life, in addition to the function that gave me as a cameraman. So I honestly think that if the patent system didn't beckon, if the idea of getting rich from it wasn't out there, luring us on, I think I might have stopped at an earlier prototype and made remarkable films of my own, and sadly watched people copy it, because your incentive to, I had, in those dollars, I had a lot of dough in the thing, and it was the idea that it could be protected that allowed me to make a license. And in fact, we protected that patent for its entire life. It was never successfully infringed. It's a wonderful era in my patent existence. So no, I don't believe it for a moment. I don't think our creativity would be as rich without it.
So I'm tempted to take another question, but that's a perfect note to end on, and I'm going to try a rare feat of actually ending a panel close to on time today. So if we would take a moment and just thank our panelists for their participation today.